The ledge was barely wide enough. It cut across the cliff face in a narrow line of fractured stone, sloping just enough to shed loose gravel, but not enough to forgive a misplaced hoof. Below it, the mountain dropped away sharply, exposing depth that did not announce itself with sound. The mountain goat stood still. All 4 hooves were placed deliberately, weight distributed not for comfort, but for certainty. Her body angled slightly inward, shoulder close to rock, horns tilted back to avoid catching on the uneven wall behind her. The stone beneath her feet had held well earlier. Now it felt different. The sun had reached this face sooner than expected, its angle low but direct, warming the surface unevenly. Patches of shadow still clung to recesses, but the ledge itself lay exposed, absorbing heat it would not release quickly. The goat tested pressure gently. The stone did not crumble, but it no longer bit back with the sharp resistance of cold rock. A faint smoothness had crept in, subtle, but enough to matter. She did not move. Movement was risk. The ledge had been chosen carefully hours earlier, when shade still covered it and cold locked fragments together. Crossing then had been efficient. Crossing now would be negotiation. Above her, the slope rose steeply toward broken scree that shifted under weight. Below her, nothing offered correction. The ledge was the only stable line between 2 unreliable choices. The goat listened. Wind moved weakly along the face, not enough to cool stone, only enough to carry fine grit that rasped faintly against rock. The sound did not travel far. Everything here felt close, compressed by height and exposure. She lowered her head slightly and sniffed. No moisture lingered. No seepage softened the stone. The rock was dry through its depth, warming evenly, losing the brittleness that made edges trustworthy. This was dangerous. Mountain goats relied on friction more than strength. Warm stone reduced both grip and predictability. Cracks that held firm when cold could shift without warning as heat expanded them. The goat shifted her rear hoof a few centimeters. Carefully. The movement was slow enough to be almost invisible. The hoof lifted just enough to reseat into a micro-depression where texture remained. The stone answered with a faint scrape, not a crack, but not silence either. She froze again. Her breathing slowed, chest barely moving, muscles engaged without flexing, holding tension in a narrow range that allowed reaction without overcommitment. The ledge began to feel smaller, not because it changed shape, but because margin did. Above, loose stones ticked softly as heat worked its way into the slope. One pebble broke free and fell, its sound cut off quickly by distance. The goat did not follow it with her eyes. Looking down did not help. The stone continued to warm. Not quickly, relentlessly. The goat held position, knowing that patience here was not waiting for improvement, but waiting for the exact moment when stillness stopped being safer than motion. She would have to move, not now, but soon. And as the sun climbed higher and the cliff face absorbed more heat than it could release, the goat remained pressed against the mountain, balanced on a line that had been reliable only hours earlier, aware that this day survival would not be decided by how steep the cliff was, but by how quietly the stone beneath her hooves changed while she waited for the last moment cold still offered grip. The change was not sudden. It arrived in increments so small that only a body trained to depend on stone could register them. The ledge did not collapse. It did not crack loudly or shed weight. It simply began to respond later than it should have. The goat felt it through her hooves. Pressure no longer returned immediately. Where cold stone had pushed back sharply, warm stone absorbed weight for a fraction of a second before resisting. That delay, barely perceptible, altered balance enough to demand constant correction. She shifted her neck slightly, not to look, to rebalance. Muscle groups along her shoulders tightened while her hindquarters stayed almost motionless. Any large adjustment would ripple outward, disturbing stone that was already negotiating cohesion. The ledge warmed unevenly. Sunlight reached it in bands, leaving some sections marginally cooler than others. The goat tracked these differences instinctively, noting where shadow still preserved texture and where glare had smoothed it. She tested the forward edge again. A hoof pressed down. The surface held, but the sensation was different. Less edge, more slide contained by friction rather than structure. The hoof did not seat itself as deeply as before. She withdrew it immediately. Above her, the mountain responded. A faint ticking sound ran along the cliff face as stone expanded. It was not audible as fracture, only as movement settling into new positions. Tiny grains loosened and skittered downslope, bouncing off the ledge and falling away. Each sound shortened margin. The goat remained still long enough for her breathing to slow again. Heat crept into her coat where it touched rock, transferring warmth inward instead of away. She needed to move, but not blindly. She angled her head upward, scanning the slope above the ledge. Scree lay there in unstable sheets, fragments resting against one another at angles that relied on cold to remain locked. Crossing upward now would require disturbing them. Below offered nothing. The ledge remained the only line that allowed choice. She moved one hoof forward. Slow. Measured. The stone accepted it, then shifted almost imperceptibly, settling rather than slipping. The movement ended cleanly, but it left behind a changed surface, smoother where friction had been burned away. She froze again. The ledge no longer reset itself. Every movement altered it permanently. The goat's ears flicked briefly as another pebble fell from above, this one larger. It struck the ledge behind her and shattered, scattering fragments outward. That sound mattered. It meant the slope above was losing cohesion faster than the ledge itself. Waiting longer would not improve conditions. The goat tightened her body against the rock and prepared for a sequence rather than a single move. She would not step and stop repeatedly. That strategy had expired. She would move deliberately, continuously, minimizing repeated loading of the same points. The stone continued to warm. Not enough to fail outright. Enough to stop forgiving hesitation. And as the goat held herself poised against the cliff face, muscles tuned for precision rather than power, she understood that this ledge, once a reliable bridge, had become a timed negotiation, where survival would depend not on strength or bravery, but on choosing the exact moment when motion replaced stillness before the mountain decided for her how much grip cold was allowed to leave behind. The sound came from above, not loud. Not at first. A dry click, followed by a scrape that travelled sideways rather than down. The goat registered it instantly, not as danger yet, but as change. Stone was moving where it should not. She pressed closer to the cliff face, shifting weight inward without lifting her hooves. The ledge answered with a muted grind, friction giving way to compression, not failure, but not silence either. Another sound followed. Heavier. A stone dislodged from the scree above and slid a short distance before stopping against a cluster of fragments. The impact sent a tremor through the rock face, subtle but legible. The ledge vibrated once, then settled again. The mountain was adjusting. Heat had reached deeper layers now, not just the surface. Expansion worked inward, loosening bonds that had held overnight. The slope above her had entered a different phase. One where gravity began to participate more actively. The goat did not look up. Looking did not improve outcome. She listened instead, mapping sound to depth and direction. Small movements meant redistribution. Larger ones would mean release. Another pebble fell, then another, not a slide, a warning. The ledge beneath her hooves felt warmer now, almost neutral. No longer cold enough to sharpen texture, no longer hot enough to crumble outright. This was the most dangerous state. Stone in transition did not behave predictably. She moved, not forward, sideways. A controlled lateral shift, transferring weight from her left forehoof to her right, then easing her hindquarters to follow. The motion was continuous, unbroken, denying the ledge time to respond to repeated loading. The stone resisted, then yielded slightly, settling under her weight before stopping cleanly. She did not pause. Pausing would load the same point again. She continued. The ledge narrowed briefly where erosion had eaten into its outer edge. Below, air pressed upward without support, offering nothing to catch or slow. Above, the scree ticked again. Louder this time. The goat accelerated by degrees, not enough to lose precision, but enough to shorten exposure. Her hooves placed in a sequence she had already chosen, not reacting, but executing. A stone fell close. It struck the ledge ahead of her and exploded into fragments, some bouncing outward, others skittering inward toward the wall. One piece grazed her foreleg lightly, a sharp tap that did not break skin but confirmed proximity. That was enough. She committed. The goat surged forward the final distance along the ledge, muscles working in coordinated tension, hooves finding purchase where cold still lingered in shade cast by a slight overhang. The stone here answered more cleanly, not forgiving, but predictable. She reached a recess. A shallow notch cut into the cliff face where the ledge widened just enough to allow full weight to settle without negotiation. She stepped into it and stopped. Above her, the mountain released. A small slide gave way, not massive, but decisive. Stones rattled downward, missing her position by meters, scattering into air and silence below. The ledge she had just crossed shuddered, then stabilized again, altered but intact. The goat stood pressed into the recess, sides heaving now, breath finally allowed to deepen. Heat continued to radiate from stone, but here it was contained, less exposed. She waited, not for calm, for confirmation. The mountain quieted slowly. No further slides followed. The ticking ceased. The moment had passed. The ledge would not be crossed again today, not safely, but she had crossed enough. And as the goat stood in the narrow shelter she had reached just before the mountain chose to move on its own terms, she understood that survival here had not depended on daring or speed, but on recognizing the precise instant when waiting stopped being caution and became risk, and when motion, though costly, was the only way to remain aligned with a surface that no longer promised to hold its shape for anyone who hesitated too long. The recess held. It was not comfortable, barely wider than her body, sloped just enough to force constant adjustment, but it was stable. The stone here remained cooler, shaded by the cliff's curvature and protected from direct sun. Texture still bit back when pressed. The goat stayed still. Now, stillness was safe again. Her breathing slowed gradually, chest rising and falling in deeper, more even cycles. Muscles that had held tension for hours began to release it in stages, not all at once. Releasing too quickly invited imbalance. Below her, stones finished falling. The sound faded into distance, swallowed by the drop and the air below. When silence returned, it was different from before, not compressed, not expectant, but settled. The mountain had adjusted, for now. The goat shifted one hoof slightly, testing the recess. The stone answered cleanly. No delay, no slide. Cold still lived here. She angled her head outward and looked along the cliff. The ledge she had crossed was changed. Its outer edge looked softer now, less defined. Fracture lines were visible where none had been before, thin and pale against darker stone. It would not hold the same way again until cold returned. She would not cross back. That mattered less than it might have earlier. Roots in mountains were temporary agreements. They existed only while conditions allowed them to exist. Once broken, they were not mourned, only replaced. The goat waited until the sun climbed farther overhead and shadows shifted again, retreating from the face she occupied. Heat moved past her position now, sliding higher, leaving this pocket relatively unchanged. This was the window. She moved again, slowly, stepping upward and inward toward a series of broken steps that climbed into steeper ground above the ledge. Here, stone was rougher, fractured more deeply, offering holds that relied on shape rather than temperature. The climb was short, demanding, but honest. Each placement returned immediate feedback. Each movement altered the surface less than the ledge had. Progress came in vertical meters rather than horizontal risk. When she reached the slope above, she stopped and looked back once. Not down. At the line she had crossed. It lay quiet now, unchanged in appearance, giving no sign of how close it had come to refusal. From a distance, it still looked usable. That was always the danger. The goat turned away. She moved higher, toward ground that would hold longer into the day, where cold lingered beneath fractured stone and shade returned sooner. Her pace remained measured, conserving strength for what followed rather than celebrating what had passed. The stone continued to warm behind her. It would cool again by night, perhaps becoming reliable once more, or it would shed more of itself before then, reshaping the cliff permanently. Either way, it no longer concerned her. She had crossed when crossing was still possible. She had waited only as long as waiting preserved safety. And by leaving the ledge before heat finished rewriting its behavior, the mountain goat preserved the one advantage that mattered most in high places where conditions shifted quietly and without warning: the ability to recognize when the surface beneath you was no longer something to trust, and to move on while trust was still optional rather than already gone. The mountain stood, the ledge remained, but the goat was elsewhere, and that was enough.